Clara is not only an important member of our department in political economy, history of economic thought, and methodology, but she's also an excellent and popular teacher. I've got this thing from here. Clara has an MA in philosophy from the University of Pavia, a PhD in economics from the Institute for Advanced Studies at Pavia, and recently she was selected as a scholar at the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton University, my alma mater. And I note that the address there is 1 Einstein Drive. That's not a bad address, I have to say. We're here to celebrate the publication of her new book, The Capital Order, How Economists Invented Austerity and Paved the Way for Fascism. To Fascism, from the University of Chicago Press. If you looked at the book, you see that it received many accolades from eminent economists. Thomas Piketty says he considers to be historical political economy at its best. Several other eminent scholars, such as Robert Skidelsky, Keynes's biographer Robert Skidelsky, the political scientist Mark Blythe, the heterodox economist James Galbraith, our own graduate, Mariana Mazzucato, is now the director of the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose at the University College London, and of course, the famous and ever active political economist, Yanis Varoufakis. They've all noted how illuminating our historical analysis and how relevant it is to present times. A key point in her book is that the political economy there is a strong political economy to the self-claimed neutralities of neutral economics. For instance, when I was a graduate student, we were told that the Cobb-Douglas production function and an aggregate production function in general says that each class deserves the marginal product of its activities, the marginal contribution to output. So wages get the marginal product of labor, capital gets the marginal product of capital. And this, we were told, is neutral, equitable, and efficient. And Cobb-Douglas specifically say that this was a construction aimed at overthrowing the Marxian view. Well, Clara's book makes that eminently clear in historical context and political context. And I have to say, our department has always supported political economy, and Clara is an absolutely perfect illustration of what we have done and what we should be doing. So, Clara, I welcome you, and I look forward to hearing the rest of your talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So first of all, I would like to say hi to all of you. It's really for me a great pleasure and honor to be giving this talk amongst the New School community. And also I would like to thank Anwar, because Anwar believed in this project from the very early moments. So I would like to just tell a brief personal story, which is that I was doing my fourth year of PhD, and no one in Sant'Anna really believed my work deserved any attention, because there were not enough agent-based models in the story. And I wrote to Anwar in an email saying, I'm an Italian scholar. I'm visiting New York. I would really love to come as a visiting scholar at the New School, and attaching a small part of the dissertation. And I received an email that really for me was the best thing that could ever happen. He responded immediately saying, I read your work. It's actually very important. Why don't you come give a seminar at the New School? And so it's then that I got to come give a seminar. And then I was lucky enough that we were hiring. So the round before this hire, and then it happened. And I put all my energy to getting the position. And I must say that the book has evolved a lot. So it was, this is the outcome of my PhD dissertation. But from then to transforming it into an actual book, here's the cover, took many years. So it's a work that is almost 10 years old in the making. And the result of this book comes out of the conversation with my colleagues in the department, especially Anwar and Duncan have really been important mentors whom really have helped me shape the content of the book. and also through all the discussion with the students and all the learning we've done together during the seminars. So really, this is the product, not just an individual product, but the product of the New School community. And because as any work, any book, any scholarly contribution is never of the individual. If you take my methodology seminar, this becomes more than clear, and this has been understood by many philosophers and historians of science. So I would say this is a book that really is born out of all the intellectual insights and stimulations I got from the New School. And again, I owe a lot to Anwar, because he was the one who actually believed in me from the very, very early stages. So I made it, and I'm really happy. So the book is actually getting quite some attention right now. It's getting attention, unfortunately, because the topic is extremely timing. We are seeing how austerity, the A word, is back with a vengeance globally. And this is obvious not only in the interest rate hikes that we've been seeing spiking up for months now, from the Fed to the ECB to the Bank of England to also the Central Bank of India and other central banks, but also now back to actually tightening the belt and especially curbing fiscal expenditures. So I'm here in the UK right now. I'm giving a book tour in Bristol in the exact moment. And we know that the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Hunt, is going to announce billions in cuts in the UK next Thursday, so in a couple of days. And this is happening in a moment in which Great Britain has never stopped cutting its social expenditures since the 2009 crisis. So the real big problem is that they have no idea where to cut anymore, because if you read The Guardian and other articles, the situation, for example, in state schools is extremely dire. So what does the capital order try to do? The capital order tries to give a different answer to why austerity and why is austerity so persistent. This book is a little bit of a critique to the usual talking points of, let's say, progressive Keynesians in their understanding of austerity. In the introduction, I say, austerity is often perceived as madness, as bad policy coming out of bad economic theory. And this has been the line of many, heterodox economists. However, I don't think this line really helps us quite understand why is austerity so persistent. Why are we self-inflicting a crisis upon our economists through this huge monetary deflation and fiscal contractions? So it's here that I think a critique of the Keynesian position on austerity emerges if we adopt, of course, a class analysis. And this is why I even started the book, was that I was not really, content with the usual understanding of austerity, not just by those, of course, who believed in expansionary austerity, and so, supporters of austerity, but also those who were critical of austerity seem to really somehow depoliticize the matter. So austerity was viewed as a technical tool that was supposedly trying to manage the economy by boosting economic growth and cutting inflation and the deficit. But the reality was that everyone was saying, well, it's not working in achieving its stated goals of balancing the budget and refurbishing economic growth. So really, a lot of progressive economists have no other answer but to say, well, this is madness then. I mean, it's just a compulsive repetition of bad theory and bad policy. Now, of course, we can argue this is part of the story, but I think there's a much more interesting, deeper story if we adopt the lens of political economy. And this is where we can really think about the fact that austerity is successful in the deeper end of stabilizing capital. So that's why the title of the book is The Capital Order. The claim here, the main thesis is that in order for any type of economic growth under capitalism to happen, capital, not just as a commodity and as money, commodities and money are constantly reinvested only if capital as a social relation of production is stabilized and diffused throughout our societies. So of course, this is the basic intuition of Marx's Capital, nothing new here, but it's something that I think a lot of economists lose sight of when they discuss economic policy and economic theory. So the basic point here is to say austerity may not be successful in stabilizing economies, but it's successful in a much more fundamental operation of stabilizing class relations and making sure that capital as a social relation of production by which the majority of us on the globe are forced to sell their labor power in return for a wage is in fact not contested and is kept strong. So austerity as a disciplinary tool of the populations under capitalism. So what I would like to do is to show you how this role that austerity plays in foreclosing alternatives to capitalism and protecting capital as a social relation that governs us emerges very clearly at the moment in which austerity was born. So the lens of the historian, I believe, is a very critical because it allows to grasp certain truths and realities that still go on in the present time, but that become more obvious if you look back in time. So the idea is that if we look at what was happening exactly 100 years ago, this crucial role of austerity as a fundamental one-sided class war in order to preserve capitalism and its stability becomes extremely obvious. So what I will do now in the presentation is go through the story, the historical case study that I analyze in this book, and then I will conclude by showing how this case study can offer us some critical intuitions and insights to understand what is going on at present. So that's what I will do. Now, before I start, I would like to say, presenting a book, and this is, of course, my first book, so it's the first time it's the first presentations I'm giving, is a really difficult and daunting task because you want to say a lot and you have little time, and you'll never be able to cover all the material within the book. And I think someone like Anwar knows this quite well, given how thick his book is. So, so I will try to just get you guys curious. That's the point of a presentation, is to just get people curious so that potentially I hope you can read it. By the way, I have an author's discount. It's $18 with the author discount. So it's a pretty good price. And I'm going to actually, before I forget, because I need to also learn how to, in a way, promote it also from a point of view of the sales here. I'm gonna, if okay, I'm gonna just send you guys the promo code so that you can go on the Chicago Press website. It's Capital. So with this promo code until the 26th of November, the book is $18. So that's pretty good. Alrighty. So let's begin. The book starts with the shock of the Great War. The Great War, so 1914, 1918, was a moment in which the state intervened massively in the economy in order to be able to cope with the huge industrialization process and war mobilization necessary for the belligerent states in order to confront the war effort. So the fact that the state, for the first time in the history of capitalism, fundamentally breached its natural boundaries of action, it showed how laissez-faire was not the only form capitalism could take, but actually the state was first person involved in producing, in regulating the labor force, in importing. There is some background noise. So the fact that the state intervened so massively in the economy during the First World War had a very important consequence of politicizing the main pillars of capital accumulation. Wage relations and private property of the means of production, what is at the basis of the capitalist economy, were all of a sudden understood not any longer as natural givens, but workers themselves could see in first person how the continuance of exploitation was happening by political choice through decisions coming from a political institution such as the governments throughout Europe. So this repoliticization of the pillars of capitalism that I describe in chapter 1, and I show how, in fact, the government becoming the main employer acted purposefully to increase the rate of exploitation in a moment in which the workers had actually greater bargaining power because the labor supply was decreased because of the war effort. People being at the front meant that there was a lot of labor demand because production had to boost immensely, especially military production, and there were fewer workers. The state thus intervened explicitly to control the labor force, to discipline it, to avoid also labor mobility from one sector to another in order to keep productivity and exploitation high. This effort of the state to guarantee exploitation in order to win the war had an enormous political impact. Chapter 2, 3, and 4 of my book show how after the First World War, the majority of the citizens in Western Europe were no longer going to accept society as it stood until that moment. Everyone from the left to the right, from the workers to the bourgeoisie, were convinced that capitalism was fundamentally at the end of its life. So this was, I did a lot of archival work and read a lot of the newspapers of the time. Of course, you can read any newspaper, again, from bourgeois newspapers like the Times, the Economist, to the Daily Herald or L'Ordine Nuovo, so more workers-led papers. Everyone was saying, this is the end of our economic system as it stands. There are alternatives that are emerging and they will take over. So the first part of the book is fundamentally devoted to reconstructing this existential crisis of capitalism. And again, it's crisis of capitalism because it was not just a matter of an economic problem of high debt and high inflation. High inflation was in itself a political problem, right? And this is something that, of course, we see also today, and why experts also today are very worried about inflation, is that it becomes clear that inflation has the capacity to trigger a breakdown of the consensus of the dominant ideology by which capitalism and the market economy work efficiently and for the good of all. So this is Keynes in 1920. He wrote a memorandum of money. This you can find at the Treasury Archives in Kew Gardens. He wrote a note in which he says very clearly, a continuance of inflationism and high prices will not only depress the exchanges, but by their effect on prices will strike at the whole basis of contract, of a security, and of the capitalist system generally. So it's very clear how inflation was provoking a fundamental delegitimization of a society that depended on the market for organizing production and distribution. This crisis was not only negative, it was very positive in the sense that there was a lot of alternative experiments of how society could actually be shaped from that moment on. So the Red Biennium, 1918-1920, was full of experiments for new societies. So of course, I focus on the West in Europe, and I'll tell you why in a minute. But so leaving aside the fact that we had a revolution going on in Russia and in other states in the East, also in England and Britain, which are my case studies, we saw how there was a very wide spectrum of possibilities for change that went from more reconstructionist ideas by which we could just imagine having political priorities take over economic priorities. So a whole bunch of ideas of how we could have workers' education institutions, public housing, right, home fit for heroes. The birth of the welfare state, the modern welfare state, took place in that moment. So the enlightened bureaucrats who were trying to appease the population by proposing very radical and advanced social reforms that were also, for example, there was a women's housing subcommittee in Britain. It was part of the Ministry of Reconstruction that was really trying to figure out the material conditions that would allow women workers to be more emancipated, proposing, for example, communal holiday homes for workers in Britain. So from these more reformist, very advanced proposals, all the way to more extreme proposals, from the idea of nationalization of the main industries. So the Sankey Committee was all about nationalizing coal in 1919, and this was discussed again on the pages of the Times and in British Parliament. There was the idea that workers, that the main industries in the countries would become public industries, and this went hand in hand with the idea of self-management of industry, so self-governance, not just state-run enterprises, but an active role of workers. Then we went to more radical ideas of guild socialism, and all the way to understandings of actually subverting both the capitalist state and the capitalist market through workers' councils. So how the British shop steward movement, which was a very radical understanding of how the nucleus of a new state could only emerge if economic democracy was built from the factory floor all the way up through federations of councils, was paired in a very successful way in Italy with the whole Ordine Nuovo movement of Antonio Gramsci, who is a big character in my book. In chapter 4, I discuss how this melding of ideas, international ideas, inspired by the Russian Soviets, but also by the shop stewards, found a very concrete experimental ground in Turin, by the way, the country where I actually grew up. So I'm very connected also geographically and emotionally to that area. Gramsci actually initiated with his comrades and the workers an occupation of the factories that lasted almost a month in 1920, in which the ideas that were being discussed in L'Ordine Nuovo, which was the magazine, were actually put into practice. So this is chapter 4. Chapter 4 delves into the greatest threat to capitalism at that point, which was actually the revolutionary idea of workers' council movement. Now, this is the first part of the book, the existential crisis of capitalism, how it came about because of the great shock of the First World War, and all of the different experiments and practices and ideas that were put on the table from the illuminated bourgeoisie all the way to the most revolutionary workers' movements. Now, before I move on, I would also like to say that the effort of chapter 4, which is again devoted to L'Ordine Nuovo of Gramsci, is to also show how different actions and different movement towards change require different processes of thinking. So it's interesting to see how the concept of praxis that Gramsci develops in the prison notebooks that are written later when he's actually jailed in 1927 or 1926, I never remember, he's put into jail by Mussolini. All his work on the prison notebooks is actually the result of his practical engagement and firsthand engagement in the workers' council movement in the Fiat factory in Turin. So here we really see how thought and action mutually reinforce one another. You cannot act differently if you cannot think differently, and you cannot think differently if you don't act differently, right? And this was obvious, and it was also obvious that these guys had a very clear understanding of an emancipatory economic doctrine. It was not too developed all the way, but there was clear germs of a very interesting way of understanding, for example, the centrality of the labor theory of value, which put at the center stage the worker as a sort of source of value, and thus the possibility of overcoming vertical class relations and exploitation through the idea that we could all become horizontally producers. So the centrality of workers' agency, which is clearly something that the neoclassical framework, the model that then was imposed itself in those years in the early 20th century, worked exactly to disempower the worker, also from a theoretical point of view, right? So not only it disempowered the worker through austerity policies, but these austerity policies were backed by theory that expelled, of course, class conflict and expelled the role of the worker as the main source of value from the very models. So I think the first part of the book for me has a legitimacy in its own right, because I think it's something that is very inspiring still for the present. So the reason why I reconstructed all of these alternatives through a big, long archival work is to actually give voice to that moment and have that moment speak for us and tell us, hey, these were things that were happening, and these intuitions, especially the understanding that you cannot have political democracy without embedding it into economic democracy. So the fact that representative democracy is fundamentally an empty bourgeois rhetoric if we do not actually have a democratic management of production and distribution of resources. This is all things that I think still speak to us a lot in the present. So the idea of the first part of the book is not only to give a sense of the existential crisis of capitalism after the First World War, which of course is the preamble for the second part of the book. It's also in its own right a kind of also manifesto, a historical manifesto to show how these insights, these historical experiments were strong and were concrete, and they can still serve as, I think, inspiration for present struggles, and to understand really how we should not get tricked into the understanding that capitalism is such a humane and flexible system that can actually promote universal well-being while still keeping the profit motive. At that time, it was clear that the profit motive as the DNA of capitalism was being condemned, and people were realizing how there is really no way to reform capitalism because of its structural limits. Thus, the need to rethink the pillars of capitalism itself and to think about production for use rather than production for profit, and communal property of the means of production instead of private property of the means of production. Okay. So red years, a lot of expectations for change, a lot of concrete practices of change. And this is where, of course, the ruling class gets organized. And this is why austerity is born then. The claim of this book is that austerity is actually structural to capitalism, right? If you look at the long history of capitalism, which is not that old as a system, as we know, the claim here is that capitalism requires austerity in order to actually survive unchallenged. Now, so this seems almost in contradiction with the idea that austerity was born and invented in a specific historical moment, namely in 1920. Now, this was pointed out to me actually in a conversation at SOAS I had yesterday on the book, and I found it a very important point. So I would like to explain why I suggest that it was actually invented after the First World War. And the reality is that I believe in something that Robert Skidelsky actually wrote in 1981 when he was discussing the Treasury view. He wrote a very, now a very old article in which he says, the Treasury view really only emerged once it was challenged. And this is kind of the same insight that guides my findings in the book, is that austerity was really always there, all right? A laissez-faire capitalism of the 1800s was austere capitalism fundamentally, right? There was no social redistribution. It was all about private property, and it was always about monetary deflation in order to remain on the gold standard. Now, it's in the moment in which the natural and obvious existence of capitalism is challenged that austerity really emerges as a counteraction, as a project to actually defeat the challenges to the system. So this is why I claim that it's invented then. It's invented because it's only then that experts and bureaucrats at the head of government needed to wield their most powerful weapons, both in terms of theory and in terms of policy, to prevent radical social change, right? So it's invented in the moment in which the status quo is challenged, and it's invented in the sense that it's a political project that is put together in order to avoid any breaking down of the capital order. So the restabilization of the capital order is the main objective of austerity. So the second part of the book fundamentally begins with the two international financial conferences in Brussels and in Genoa, 1919, 1920, 22, in which for the first time economists, professors, were called to advise governments on the best way out of this economic disaster. So, of course, what is very scary to see is that the same talking points that we hear over and over again right now about the fact that we're living above our means, that austerity is an economic necessity if we want to get out of the downturn. I mean, now it's not even an economic downturn, out of the disorder, let's say, out of this disorderly situation, is to sacrifice our demands for change and accept to produce more and consume less. So the motto austerity that was coined at these international financial conferences was produce more, consume less, thrift and hard work. And this was the recipe that all citizens around Europe had to just accept as the best way forward. Now you can see how, if we think about it today, people tend to accept it. In that historical moment, it was so anachronistic because it wasn't, the economists really had to really put on their best efforts to impose it once more on a population that was no longer willing to accept this recipe for economic recovery. So the book tries to get into how austerity was a political project that was made of a double strategy, namely coercion and consensus. And this coercion and consensus, of course, worked hand in hand. And so I would like now to speak briefly about what coercion meant and what consensus meant. After this, I would like to say just a couple of words about why I compare and contrast the Italian case of fascist Italy with the British case of parliamentary democracy. And then finally, we get to how this is relevant for today. So that's what I'm going to try to do, and I'll try to keep it within the next 15 minutes so we have more time for questions. Coercion. The austerity trinity was put into operation. It was theorized and talked about at these international conferences, and then this code, this austerity code, was then implemented broadly, actually throughout the globe, even if I focus on these two countries. How do you coerce people into accepting the capitalist status quo? Well, you have to increase market dependence. You have to increase the vulnerability of us as wage workers, as fundamentally having no choice but to accept selling our labor power in return for a wage at also a low price. So here's where I can't get into the details, but I try to show how monetary policy, fiscal policy, and industrial policy worked hand in hand and mutually reinforced one another. So when I talk about fiscal austerity, I'm not talking about budget cuts in general, okay? This is, I think, is important. It's something that I think a lot of Keynesian macroanalysis misses, is that we're not talking about aggregates here. We're talking about where are you cutting? The fact that the budget is not going down because the United States is increasing military expenditure doesn't mean that there isn't fundamental austerity if you look at the fact that it's slashing constantly on social benefits, right? And now we know, for example, that the Republicans are trying now to say how Medicare needs rethinking. So fiscal austerity is about cuts in welfare spending, and I show how this happened throughout Italy and Britain massively, but it's also about where does the revenue of the state come in. So while you cut social expenditures and you increase our market dependence by taking away any rights to, for example, social benefits that were just born, by the way, after the First World War, you're also taxing the majority, right? So regressive taxation is the other side of fiscal austerity, which means that you are increasing consumption taxes that, of course, hit all of us in the same way, notwithstanding how much we earn. And at the same time, you are, for example, cutting all of the extra profit taxes on, for example, increased profits during the war, right? So all of the capital levy that was big in Britain during the war, all of corporate taxes or taxes on profits were curtailed. So this is fiscal austerity. Then we have monetary austerity, which is what we see exactly today again. It's hikes in interest rates. And finally, what I call industrial austerity, which is direct attack on organized labor, and especially privatization. So again, privatization, so you fire a lot of public employees. This makes it such that, again, these public employees are vulnerable to market competition, and they will accept, as neoclassical economists put it, a lower reservation wage, right? So again, fiscal, monetary, industrial austerity working together, and I showed the details of how this happened. And this coerces people into accepting the status quo. How? Well, in the case of fascist Italy, you coerce workers directly because of state intervention in, for example, repressing wages. So wages were repressed by law. And you curtailed you banned strikes and you banned unions, except for the fascist union. So coercion is more direct. But coercion is also the result, indirectly, of the workings of those who tweak the dials of macroeconomic management, namely the Treasury in England and the Bank of England, who were fundamentally engineering a downturn. So in 1920, because of the 7% interest rate hikes that lasted for 6 months, the British economy faced an enormous downturn. And this resulted into immediately increases in interest in unemployment rates, which meant the end of workers' militancy. So chapter 9 of the book actually really shows, also through statistical data and through stylized facts, what this coercion looked like. And especially shows you that, of course, this is, again, not my intuition. It's enough to read the work of Michael Kalecki to know very well that once you increase unemployment, the bargaining power of the workers is killed off, and people will just accept the natural functioning of capitalism through wage relations, and especially low wages. So this is the coercive side about how you actually, the material conditions of the majority are curtailed so that they have to face the brutal, impersonal forces of the market. Coercion goes hand in hand with consensus building. And this is where the role of economic theory is very important to my story. And why actually, even if I'm talking more in general terms here, the book is actually a reconstruction of the agency of specific experts. So I tell a story that is about specific experts that were very, that at the time were very influential in leading state policies, both in Britain and in Italy. So in Italy, we had the rise of pure economics. So marginalism was actually, it was a battle that was being fought in academia because the marginalist thinkers like Mattei Pantaleoni, who was one of the founders of the marginalist school at the level really of Valra or Jevons, Pantaleoni was fighting a battle within academia to expel the historical tradition that was still actually dominant in Italy at the beginning of the 20th century. And while he was fighting a battle within academia to gain primacy of the new economic paradigm, which was the marginalist framework, he was also fighting a policy battle. And with him, other of his pure economics colleagues, right? So the marginalist framework at the time was called pure economics. And this is very important because, of course, it's the whole idea of bringing economics up to the level of any natural science and expelling all the political implication. And of course, in the moment in which you expel political implications from supposedly your model, you're actually undertaking the most political action of all, because you're trying to actually convince the general population that the recipe you're proposing, which is a fundamental recipe that extracts resources from the majority to put in the hand of the minority, is done for the good of the whole. So we see here how this novel economic paradigm is diffusing. I look at pure economics in Italy, so actual very standard marginalist thought, and Hawtrian economics in Great Britain. And Ralph Hawtrey, who is a less known character, he was actually very influential, not only for Keynes, but also for the whole of the Chicago monetarist tradition. And here we see how his theory was all about the fact that in order to defeat inflation, you had to shape the behavior of citizens in order for them to consume less and thus I can't find the word, and thus to, of course, restrain aggregate demand. So this dual agenda, consensus building through these novel paradigms in economic theory, and I cannot get into the details, and I hope you guys can read chapter 6 and 7 on the book that spends a lot of time on this, and then coercion through the inflicting a downturn which kills the bargaining power of the workers. Now, these common trends are seen in two polar opposite institutional frameworks. And here's where I would like to give a sense of another kind of provocative message of this book is fascism and liberalism are usually understood to be polar opposite ideological and institutional worlds, right? You imagine them as being in a very clear dichotomy opposing one another. Now, the book, The Capital Order, instead tries to say, wait a minute, if you put at the center of your analysis austerity, you realize how there is a very thin line that actually separates liberalism from fascism. And when I talk about liberalism, I'm talking about classical liberalism, of course. So the story is told in two very diverse political institutional settings. We have the rise of Mussolini to power in 1922, right after the Red Biennium. Mussolini rises to power. By the way, not through a coup. The March of Rome was not a coup. And this is something that I would like you guys to like really consider. People living in the 1920s didn't really understand that a full-blown dictatorship was being formed. Mussolini was called by the king to fix a political crisis. Very similar to what we constantly see in Italy with all these technocrats, by the way, right? So Mussolini was called as the right man at the right time. He had won some votes in the previous elections. And Mussolini was hailed as the only man who was going to be able to be strong enough to actually implement austerity in Italy. So Mussolini as the best student of austerity, and Mussolini thus gaining the support of the whole liberal establishment, both within Italy and internationally. And this is an important message, is to show not only that what was happening in Italy under Mussolini in the 1920s was mirrored almost equivalently in Britain in the 1920s. Of course, again, with the caveat that while it was the political coercion of the fascist state was much more overt in the case of Italy, while in Britain it was the experts at the Bank of England, at the Treasury, who were enacting austerity measures. But again, slightly different means towards the same end of preserving the capital order. Not only is there this parallelism between the two countries, there's also the fact that Mussolini would not have become the strong dictator which he did become, and his dictatorship lasted for 20 years until he was defeated during the Second World War. His regime would not have been as sturdy and potentially would have had breaking down if it wasn't for the support of the whole liberal elite, who once more was really enthusiastically supporting Mussolini's doings. For example, this is Montagu Norman. So Montagu Norman, the head of the Bank of England. I went to the Bank of England archives, spent a lot of time there. And the best thing about doing archival work is when you find the quotes that you're like, oh my goodness, this is exactly what I was hoping to find. And at the same time, you're kind of scared that you found it. So this is what Montagu Norman was writing to Jack Morgan of JP Morgan Chase. And we know that JP Morgan Chase was hugely financing Mussolini's campaign and Mussolini's government throughout the 1920s. And this is something that I strongly advise to read, the book of Gian Giacomo Migone called The United States and Fascist Italy. I always have my students read this book, and he's focusing on the whole financial elite, and especially Wall Street, and how Wall Street was really crucial to empower Mussolini, materially speaking, with money for its regime to actually succeed. So Montagu Norman, the head of the Bank of England, so really the expression of liberalism, says to his friend Jack Morgan, fascism has surely brought order out of chaos over the last few years. Something of the kind was no doubt needed if the pendulum was not to swing too far in quite the other direction. The Duce was the right man at a critical moment. So this is just one quote, but my whole chapter 8 is full of primary sources that reconstruct the consensus over Mussolini's doing. So Mussolini, who was a very smart guy, realized that the way to achieve full-blown power in Italy was through his very strong austerity agenda, which again was all about privatization. The biggest privatization campaign in modern capitalism was done by Mussolini in those years. Layoffs of public employees, deflation and anchoring back to gold, slashes in public spending, social spending. Of course, we already said curtailing of labor rights and outlawing any strikes and unions. In the meantime, though, once more, Britain was not doing anything different. And here I would like to read you, potentially to conclude, this chapter from this quote from G.D.H. Cole. G.D.H. Cole is another protagonist in my story. And he was a guild socialist, public intellectual. He was very exposed in those years. And he wrote in 1921, when the downturn had hit the workers and the fear of being sacked out of the jobs because of the enormous increase in unemployment rates. The unemployment rate in the insured workforce in Britain reached 17%. And it was basically, there was basically no unemployment, of course, during the war and immediately after it. G.D.H. Cole writes, the big working class offensive had been successfully stalled off, and British capitalism, though threatened with economic adversity, felt itself once more safely in the saddle and well able to cope, both industrially and politically, with any attempt that might still be made from the labor side to unseat it. So I think this speaks quite clearly to our situation today, to conclude, is that how can we make sense of this self-inflicted downturn that the Fed and other central banks around the world are bringing about? And we're seeing this, obviously, and the economy in the United States is already cooling down. And we already see that there's already a lot of firing happening. Today was announced that Amazon is going to fire thousands of workers. We know that other sectors have also been affected by layoffs already. So here's where I think this historical episode makes more evident what is still true to this day, but less obvious. The fact that capital as a social relation constantly needs to be protected. And mainstream economic experts are well aware of this. So in the United States, for example, today, there was a big worry from the part of the economic establishment that the labor market is still out of order, right? There's a problem by which there's almost 2 job openings for every unemployed person. So there's all these job openings, but no one is actually willing to accept these jobs, right? So there's a big problem in the United States, according to our mainstream experts, because there's the phenomenon of the Great Resignation, by which millions of workers have actually quit their jobs from one reason or another. There's the phenomenon of the fact that there's a lot of labor demand and very little labor supply because people are just not willing anymore to engage in the social relation of production, of selling your labor power in return for a wage. Wages are just too crappy and precarious, and people are just fed up. Plus, there's also a lot of new unionization going on, right? There's a huge unionization effort going on, grassroots unions throughout the service sector, Starbucks, again, Amazon, Kellogg's, many other, and then a lot of strikes happening, right? And inflation is escalating strikes. And there is clearly, even today, if not, of course, as strongly as it was during the Red Biennium that I reconstruct, there is anyhow clearly a sense by which capital as a social relation is being questioned. It's being questioned still today. So economic experts in power know that they need to protect this economic relation. They need to fix the labor market, right? So in order to have a healthier labor market in which people are willing to go work in return for low wages, a higher unemployment rate is a necessity. And this is something that someone like Larry Summers and not even the most conservative economist out there is very explicit in telling us that, yes, in order for our market economy to function smoothly, we need fixing of the labor market right now, and we need higher unemployment rates. So I think if we start understanding austerity as a disciplinary mechanism in order to allow us all to ultimately think that capitalism is the only possible world and constrain us in our material conditions, by which it's very difficult to protest capitalism once you depend on the market for your survival. And the more you lose benefits, the more you're going to be trapped in the chokehold of austerity and of capitalism. So today, where labor militancy, of course, was not as revolutionary as the time, but it's still something unexpected, right? In the UK, where I'm right now, there hasn't been such high workers' militancy. There's strikes going on in any sector, school teachers, postal workers, railway workers, everyone's on strike. And you guys know well, because also the new school is going on strike right now. All this labor militancy is going to now have to face, which again is escalating with inflation, is going to now have to face the dire consequence of an economic downturn, which again will discipline the majority into having to accept the capital order. Now, I don't want to end with a sad note, because I think the point here is to lucidly understand the functioning of our economic system, the strategies and the ways in which the system is able to protect itself and reproduce itself. And this is the aim of this book. And I would actually like to read you the last words of chapter 10. Chapter 10 is an effort to go back and try to show how these dynamics that I show for the 1920s recur throughout the 20th and 21st century. And I end with a note of, let's say, of optimism of the intellect. Austerity is a political project arising out of the need to preserve capitalist class relations of domination. It is the outcome of collective action to foreclose any alternatives to capitalism. It can thus be subverted through collective counteraction. The study of its logic and purpose is a first step in that direction. So in this sense, I think this is very much of what I think we're all proud of as being in the new school tradition, is we got to stop idealizing how capitalism works. We need to understand how it really works and all the strategy it develops, again, to protect itself in order to actually overcome it. And I think Anwar's work, of course, in this has been very crucial. And it's even more crucial today, while I'm going on touring, kind of giving talks. The lay public is convinced that capitalism is flexible, reformable, and can take a human face. And this, I think, is the effort of the historian, or at least my effort as the historian, is to actually show, this is the real deal. This is what the history of capitalism looks like. Let's stop idealizing the system. Otherwise, we will be trapped into a future that is, again, ultimately always anchored to the status quo, which exploits the majority.